Now let's consider artificial selection. Artificial selection is a phrase that describes the deliberate manipulation by human beings of the genetic composition of a population by picking which individuals, in fact, get to reproduce. And of course, this has been used in animal and plant breeding for many thousands of years by humans, and so in agriculture, for example. And so we'll take some time now to discuss examples of artificial selection. And it is no accident, by the way, the similarity of the phrase artificial selection with the phrase natural selection is coined by Darwin. It was Charles Darwin was very familiar with artificial selection because he in fact bred pigeons, which is an example of artificial selection. We'll talk about that in just a minute. But he was certainly aware of how characteristics of populations can be modified simply by selection of which individuals in a population are allowed to reproduce and which ones are not. So let's consider agriculture first. So this is an example of how many of our familiar consumable plant items are produced. You can see here, for example, that the same species, wild mustard, was actually the ancestral plant from which many of our crops are derived. So cabbage, broccoli, kohlrabi, Brussels sprouts, kale are all actually the same species. Here's the species name right here. Notice that per earlier remarks, the species name has two parts. So this is genus Brassica. The species name for these different varieties is Brassica oleracea. It's shown in italics, and notice that the genus is capitalized and the specific part of the species name is not capitalized. So all of these vegetables are in fact produced from the same ancestral plant, and yet they're very different and distinguishable. You go into a grocery store, you are not confused by which is the broccoli and which is the cabbage because they look exactly alike. They don't actually look exactly alike. They're very different from each other in appearance, and this is because during production of these different varieties, then one can take natural variation in the wild mustard plants and pick ones that have particularly sizable apical buds, for example. And then from the plants that grow up after just selecting those plants that have a specifically large apical bud, growing those plants up and then taking again just the plants that have particularly large apical buds and doing this for generation after generation after generation after generation, you can push the phenotype, the characteristics of the population in a certain direction. And so what this diagram shows is that by selecting for different aspects of the overall phenotype, one can push the phenotype in one direction or another, thereby producing something that looks more like Brussels sprouts, or something that looks more like broccoli, or something that looks more like cabbage. This does take a number of generations, but it can be done, has been done. Another example, which might be more familiar to some of you, is selection producing dog breeds. This is an example of different kinds of dogs. Dogs are all considered a single species. There are a number of different breeds. These are just the ones that happen to start with the letter A, and I grabbed this figure from the American Kennel Association website. And so if you look at the variety of breeds on here, you can see that some are big and some are small. They have different hair distribution patterns. They have different hair color. They have different tail morphologies or lengths. Their ears are different in shape and how they fall and so on. There are over 400 different described breeds. Most of the modern breeds are actually fairly recent. They're less than 400 years old. So that gives you an idea of how many generations were necessary for breeders to select these certain characteristics which were considered desirable by the dog breeders, certain characteristics of the tail or the ears or so on. And by the way, the closest wild relative of the domestic dogs is in fact the gray wolf. Now, as mentioned before, Charles Darwin bred pigeons. This was one of his hobbies as a young man. And so this is an example of artificial selection in that breeders enjoyed taking pigeons and selecting for certain traits. We're going to go now and look at this, a little bit of this YouTube video right now.
I'm Randall Keynes. I'm a great-great-grandson of Charles Darwin, and I'm here at the building from where The Origin of Species was published just 150 years ago to look at the fancy pigeons that Darwin used at a key point in his arguments for his theory of evolution by natural selection, with John Ross, who is a pigeon breeder, judge, and exhibitor, who has brought together these 6 species and can explain them to us. John, can you explain these 2 first, which are really the most different of all the ones?
Yes, I can, Randall. The English pouter was developed by fanciers around about 1730
the size of this.
From Dutch croppers, which were a pouting pigeon. The fanciers preferred the birds with the bigger crops,
Yes.
and as the crop was developed,
Big chest, yes.
and the birds were selected for that crop, they were then highly prized, and then the breed was developed in that way. You'll also find the legs are longer, and they've got feathered legs. So of course the fanciers preferred the breeds to look in this way. Compared to the almond tumbler, which again was developed around about the 1730s.
From the same ancestor?
From the Clumber livia, the rock dove, the humble rock pigeon. The
face
short-faced
on this
almond
thing.
was bred for its very, very short beak, and also the colouring, which is quite remarkable almond colouring. And this bird was very, very highly prized at the times of Charles Darwin.
So Darwin felt that these 2 birds and the 4 others that we'll see show how species can be changed by humans breeding them selectively. And if humans can work changes like this on descendants of one bird over just a few generations, it must be possible for nature to develop new species by natural selection.
Of course, the breeds we see here today, they have taken many generations to change, but they have changed, and man has selected those changes. And to see there may be as many as 250 different types of Columba livia is quite extraordinary.
I'm going to go ahead and stop the
just by noticing
that
an odd colour feather.
Video right there. But certainly I would recommend that you all take time to go and watch the rest of that video if you're interested in that. So I think it's hard to appreciate how sort of extraordinary and bizarre looking some of these birds are, and the different ways in which the phenotype was pushed without actually seeing these, and sort of an added bonus that it is in fact one of Charles Darwin's direct descendants that is narrating the YouTube video. So these then were examples of how changes can occur over many different generations in a variety of different kinds of living organisms and plants and animals. So this was a familiar concept then to Charles Darwin and his contemporary scientists. Now, humans, by their interaction with the natural environment, often cause what could be considered sort of an inadvertent kind of artificial selection. I pulled this out of the news to show you. I believe this is from Newsweek. I'll post this as optional reading. I thought it was an interesting example for you, and what this article is about is showing that because hunters tend to preferentially shoot individuals that have the largest antlers, as shown here on this particular diagram, then the individuals that are then left to reproduce subsequently in the population tend to be the smaller ones, which is why the title of this article is "It's Survival of the Weak and Scrawny." And one has quotes in here such as, when hunters target a species alpha males, you end up letting a bunch of losers do the mating. And of course, this is a description of how the characteristics of a population can be modified by humans as they interact with the natural population and can push the remaining individuals in a one direction or another by what would be considered artificial selection, because it is by the direct manipulation of human beings in the natural environment.